Hello, I'm Oakley Flanagan, and you're listening to a live interview with Anastasia Taylor-Lind for the Poetry Archive Insider. Anastasia Taylor-Lind is an English-Swedish poet and photojournalist whose work covers issues related to war, women, and violence. Anastasia is a Nat Geo magazine photographer, a TED Fellow, and a 2016 Harvard Nieman Fellow. Anastasia has reported from various regions around the world, but she's reported a number of times from Ukraine, including the Maidan Revolution and the conflict in the Donbas region. Her debut collection, One Language, won the Poetry Business International Book and Pamphlet competition in 2021. Told from the perspective of a female photojournalist, these concise but complex and insightful poems draw on first-hand experience of war to explore how damage is both generated and perpetuated. The book's title, One Language, expresses the contradiction between the lingua franca, or the common language, of photography and the equally universal language of violence. One Language comes to an understanding of personal history and global conflict in poetry that is described as immediate and as evocative as its most urgent of dispatches. And we're going to welcome Anastasia. It's lovely to talk to you this morning. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm just so happy to be here talking with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Wow, no, it's lovely. It's lovely that you've come to speak about the book. I think it's amazing. I just wondered, why don't we kick off proceedings, maybe reading from something from the beginning of the collection, because it's probably a good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. The first poem in the collection is called Rewind, and I wrote it on the 20th anniversary of the September the 11th attacks. Rewind. It's 9/11 the first time you stay. In the morning, you bring Taliban poems back to bed. I drink cardamom coffee and you read their tender lines. May you not be hungry in the desert, my dear. Their loving is ordinary as mine. I see wilding men shouldering RPGs by the swimming pool of a warlord's compound and think they're beautiful. Watch a dentist fall to earth from an aeroplane undercarriage, rising over Kabul. Human payloads slipping from the landing gear, falling through swipes, scrolls, and clicks. Rewind the tapes. See the little man flying upwards, returning to his life. Rewind the tapes. White Bruegel's Icarus, he touches down with a splash in a rooftop water tank 4 kilometers away. His suffering unnoticed, except for a casual cell phone recording. 20 years ago, the Twin Towers man fell too, twisting and turning, high fluttering, past flames and smoke. For a moment, head first over Manhattan. Rewind the tapes. See the little men flying upwards, returning to their lives. Rewind the tapes. We lie under a marigold embroidered bedspread bought in Afghanistan. I'm afraid of you. Not you exactly, but of falling for you. My old friend Tom took me on that shopping trip in an armored vehicle with his bodyguard. And I remembered the summer before the end of uni, how he and I sat up late drinking Jameson, listening to Johnny Cash, and imagining our own deaths together somewhere in a dusty alley. All golden light, slow motion, and elevated camera angles. We took it in turns, who was doing the dying and who was doing the cradling.
Thank you. Such a powerful end there. Yeah, it's so interesting. I wondered if I could talk to you sort of about, I suppose, asking about a broad outline for your work in Ukraine as both a photojournalist and a poet, because I know that you were there in Maidan Square in 2014, and that you continue to work there in the present, spending your time between London and reporting from Ukraine. And I just wonder, if you could tell us about sort of how your work has, as a photojournalist, has kind of led to or infused your kind of first collection.
Well, I suppose the very reason I started writing poetry was because I had become so frustrated with the limitations of photography. There's a cliche that a picture can say 1,000 words, and yes, sometimes it can, but there are so many things that photographs can't say. And one of the things that I wanted to kind of bring up to the surface through my poetry is the position from which I stand and witness and observe violence. So I often make that very apparent and part of the narrative of my poems, that I am somebody who is witnessing violence without participating in it, and that witnessing of violence happens not only when I'm reporting in what we know as war zones as a photojournalist, but also when I'm at home in bed scrolling through Twitter and watching violence and the death of other human beings from my bed, as well as from my own 2 feet while I'm photographing it.
Definitely. I mean, I think that there's a definite sense in the collection of I don't know, the different ways in which like that the eye is either witnessing violence, commenting on violence, or considering kind of their own position within that violence as both, you know, someone witnessing it, but also to some extent either by documenting it, you know, in a photograph, or even by turning it into poetry, I suppose, you know. So it's a very interesting thing. But also what you mentioned really reminded me of a Louise Glick quote, particularly what you're saying maybe about some of your frustrations about the limits of photography, because she has a fairly well-known quote where she says that news stories are detailed, but they don't seem real, because their thoroughness is a quote unquote reprimand even to imagination. So they say what has happened, but they don't say what it means to be here, you know, or to describe maybe how it feels to be in a particular space. And I just wondered, how does that relate to you as being both a photojournalist and a poet, right? Because there's that element that you're straddling both concerns even in your poetry, because you're writing about something that is news or is an ongoing event, but at the same time you're working within the medium of poetry, right? And all of that kind of demands.
I mean, the question I ask myself continuously and many times a day when I'm in Ukraine now reporting is what is real, and what is real to me. And you know, news is very valuable. Those facts are very valuable. It's important to know them. So the starting point for almost everything I write about is fact, is news. But the other layer that I bring through photography, but perhaps more so through poetry, is what is real to me. And beyond what I see, beyond the dates, the location, the facts and the figures, is what I feel, what I hear, what emotional response that triggers in me as a photographer and a poet, and the effects of the distance that I, as the witness, narrator, storyteller have. What distance am I writing from, and am I photographing from? One of the founding fathers of war photography is a photojournalist called Robert Capa, and he used to say that if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. And this was initially interpreted as a sort of a practical element of photography. In order to photograph something happening, you have to be physically stood within usually a few meters of that event, and you can only photograph in present. I can't photograph something that happened last year, or even a 250th of a second ago. And you know, the way I believe that relates to poetry is well, whether I see something in the moment, whether I view it through a secondary source, a video recording, you know, something on social media, a news report, a poem written by another poet, or whether I see something myself. But actually, in more recent years, the interpretation of Robert Capa's quote, if you're not close, if your pictures aren't, sorry, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough, is now taken to mean, you know, a reference to emotional closeness. If you're not close emotionally to the people and the events that you are documenting, then your pictures won't be good enough. And I think that's true of poetry as well. You know, so often, well, it's always obvious, isn't it? When we read poems, how emotionally close the narrator or the I in that poem is. And I believe emotional closeness is one of the most powerful elements of storytelling in any form.
Totally. I wonder, is it a slightly more complicated route though? Because, you know, you spoke about how kind of from the photojournalistic perspective, facts are all, but it reminds me of something I think it's Caroline Bird says about emotional facts in poetry. So for example, you know, I also write about you know, things from personal experience, but it's obviously a very different you know, it's very different to your work because it isn't as politicized in the same way, that I'm not having to honor the facts of an ongoing situation and event. But equally, you know, the role of the poet is to, you know, bring you know, represent or shed light on an emotional truth. But usually, you know, in poetry, you arrive at this through metaphor or simile, which kind of by its nature is a sort of bending of the truth, right? It's a sort of you know, the age-old adage that, you know, if you're writing about love, you can't talk about, you know, roses anymore or compare it to roses because it's so well known. But how do you balance the kind of trickery, I suppose, that you know, you sort of have to do as a poet to try and say something fresh, with the fact that actually you, as not only as a photojournalist but as a writer, with the responsibility to you know, accurately represent what's going on in, you know, places like Ukraine that you're writing poems about, where there's conflict. How do you navigate that? Like, does it make your process a little bit harder, or is it just something that you're used to doing because you've been, you know, a photojournalist so long? And I imagine, you know, there's a lot of rigorous kind of fact checking that you have to do anyway as part of your process.
Well, I don't think people expect poets to be objective, but people do generally expect journalists to be objective. And this is an unrealistic expectation, because journalists are human beings. And when we filter stories, as we must through storytellers, the human experience of that individual always shapes how the story has been told. It doesn't matter to anyone else, but it matters very much to me that my poems, my photographs, all the stories I tell are true, are based on fact, as you say, are fact-checked. I fact-check my poems. It's a compulsion that I have, born of my career as a journalist. And also, I don't feel that anything is lost in poetry from adhering at least to the facts and then layering over them my own personal truth or as experience of those events. So for me, those two things can coexist.
Totally. And it's interesting what you were saying about maybe that we don't, you know, an image might initially come across as objective because, you know, it screams it happened, it was here. But obviously, you know, as you say, there's the subjectivity of the photographer to contend with. And I find that quite interesting because obviously when we read your collection, which is presented, you know, from the first person perspective, although the eye is still somewhat effaced for, you know, a variety of reasons, but it is that kind of almost like the Christopher Isherwood thing of like, I am a camera, like it's recording, but it's also recording with a subjectivity, right? You know, of being a female photojournalist, the double jeopardy of that position perhaps, because as well as, you know, being in a war zone and taking photographs or making photographs, as you know, as you say, in that area, you know, there's the added danger of misogyny, which is always around your eye in the collection, you know. And but there's another thing which I think we'll get to later, but the other thing that I was interested in is that throughout the collection there is, as you've said, there's always a reason why someone's taking the photograph, but in some of the poems the motivations are obviously shown as, you know, journalistic, but there's, and the importance of doing that, but there's a kind of cynicism or a self-awareness, maybe even a kind of a sense of the speaker's complicity in the book, that they're somehow you know, participating in the war machine. And it is something that you kind of ironize, sorry, throughout the book, because there are sort of moments, I think there's a kind of ironic poem in which you talk about and sort of parody the elements of what makes a photojournalistic story. And I just wondered if you could talk about that for a moment, the choice of sort of the eye from which you present the poems and why you chose to kind of frame the collection in this way, but also in particular those first poems, which to some extent, you know, have that feel of not just dispatches from the front line, but of kind of testimony and an ongoing kind of recording that's taking place of the speaker in this environment.
Well, I think I write in order to understand what I see, what I experience, my own life. The act of writing is an endeavor to discover my reactions to living, being alive. And so writing for me started not with form, but with content. I felt I had something I wanted to say. I didn't necessarily know what it was, but in hindsight, I now understand that this collection is a personal investigation of why it is that I do what I do, why I'm a photojournalist, why I chose to live my life in this way, because certainly it's more than just a job. I dedicate my whole life to this endeavor of journalism. So, well, I guess I need to be honest. As honest as I can be with myself, and to interrogate that honesty. I mean, again, that's a, for want of a better term, a transferable skill, perhaps, is to investigate what it is. I mean, it's my job to investigate what other people say, how they say it, why they say it, to push them towards their truth in that moment. And so when I write, I try to do the same of myself, a sort of a rigorous pushing towards an underlying truth in that moment. Of course, it changes over time, and my relationship with photography and photojournalism has changed over time. You know, I was 16 when I decided I wanted to become a photojournalist. And I knew from the beginning that I wanted to photograph war and mass violence, because I think I believed that somehow photography was a solution to violence. Very naively, as a teenager, I had assumed that wars took place because nobody knew they were happening. And if people just knew what was happening, then they would somehow miraculously be stopped. Of course, now I understand that that isn't true. And I also know that since the invention of photography, it's not really possible to have a war or a revolution without photographers. So I've become increasingly aware of my complicity and the complicity of photographers in as being one part of a cog in a war machine. And that's something that, for example, the British First World War poets were very aware of, that in the act of writing poems about the First World War, they were in danger of glorifying or romanticizing the very thing that they were standing against. And I think there's that dichotomy in photojournalism, particularly photojournalism of war as well.
Definitely. But there's also, I suppose, as well, within that, there are choices that you also make that maybe are political in nature, or I don't know, maybe some people would just call them best practice, about how, from the position from which that you write about this. Like, for example, and I know it seems like a very simplistic and obvious thing to say, but you refuse to enter the subjectivity of anyone who is not yourself, which isn't always a given in war poetry. And as you said, when you think of the soldier poets of the First World War, are how we see them is both as soldiers but also as poets. But then there is also that other line where there have been many poems written about soldiers or about people in a particular war or in a particular conflict by someone who was never there. But what is really interesting about your position is you're not there as a soldier, but you are there in a capacity to witness or to document. But there is a decision, obviously, in your work in the poetry, where you don't. It's not only, like you say, a refusal of made up stories or things that aren't true in inverted commas. It's also this thing that you refuse to be anyone else, or pretend to be anyone else in the work. You're just witnessing and recording it. Would you say that's a kind of a deliberate choice when you were writing the collection?
Absolutely. I don't believe that anyone has the right to inhabit somebody else's voice. And this very certain, at least for now, I guess it's a moral stance, probably is influenced by my work as a photojournalist, because photojournalism and journalism itself is wildly unequal. What we see in journalism is privileged, powerful people telling the stories of other people with less power and less privilege than they have themselves. Well, I should talk about myself. So I should talk about photojournalism to start with. 85% of photojournalists working today are men, and in reality, the closer you get to the front line, the higher that percentage gets. Most photographs in the world are made by white, middle-aged, heterosexual men from Western countries. So we have to ask the question, well, what effect does this have on the stories that we tell about people, the majority of people in the world who do not come from that demographic? What does it mean when the storyteller is always the outsider from a position of privilege and power, like myself working in Ukraine? I'm not Ukrainian. I always have the choice whether to go to Ukraine or not. And I always have the choice to leave. When I'm working, when I'm writing poems or I'm photographing, I know that my family are safe. I know that my apartment here in Hackney is not going to be bombed. That privilege may have has an effect individually on the stories that I tell as an individually. But when you pull back and look at all of the stories that are being told, it creates a massive bias. There's an African proverb that says, until the lion is the storyteller, the hunter, I'm ad-libbing here, but until the lion is the storyteller, the hunter, oh God, I can't even remember it now. I'm sorry.
I think it's, yeah, all the tales will be of the hunter, isn't it? Until, yeah, all the tales will be of the hunter and about the hunter.
Yeah. So, so, if we look at the history of journalism, of poetry probably too, and we see people writing from the perspective of the outsider, imagining the insider's view. I don't know. I just have a feeling it's dangerous. Now I don't. Because we're almost always punching down to inhabit the voices of people who are more disenfranchised than we are. I love poetry that inhabits the voices of the powerful and the privileged, that punches up, that speaks for politicians or kings, but usually that isn't the case. Does that make sense? I feel I'm
No, totally. I suppose the one thing I would ask you though is that and I completely agree with it, but in the collection, the speaker isn't necessarily they are an outsider, but they are an outsider, if that makes sense, in the sense of there is the inherent privilege, as you say, of going to a place that is not your own country, that is being invaded, and like you say, being able to leave that. But whilst they're in that space, they are at risk. But also, as I said before, the speaker is a woman, and the kind of persistent threats to her, be that kind of imagined or fear or expected or actual misogyny, coupled with the actual, which maybe we'll move into now, but the very interesting backstory that you yourself have had and how you grew up. It seems that your eye, or the kind of the poems that you write about, do have that outsider perspective. Okay, when we initially enter into the collection, it's an outsider, of which as you say, it's somebody who is not from this place, and they are reporting or documenting it and actually feeling guilty. I mean, there's a really interesting bit where you're definitely, the speaker is definitely making value judgments about the environment, something about that people are burning their own houses down rather than letting the quote unquote enemy like destroy them. And then you're like, oh, I feel bad for saying that, but it is it's so you kind of are harsh on your speaker or on yourself in that moment. But then in the next kind of suite of the collection, when the poems really look at childhood experiences and your upbringing, it's a definite sense of what I get from it is of being an outsider from broad society. And I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit about your own upbringing and how that infused the poems, because I do think, even though as you correctly say, and I completely agree about that outsiderness as a kind of voyeurism that should be we should be suspicious of. There is also the other kind of outsider, which is somebody who is not the same as everyone else in society, right? And I do think there is those poems in the second bit really do do touch on ideas of difference, because quite literally, I mean, the childhood poems, you didn't grow up how other people grew up, if you know what I mean.
I think the reason I started writing about my own experiences of violence inside my childhood home came from a question that I've been asked several times at speaking events. Quite often I present my photographs and talk about them at conferences and photo festivals. And I found that I was often asked the question, something along the lines of, isn't it dangerous to be in these spaces as a woman? Or how do you ensure that you're safe as a woman? And I always answered these questions by saying, yes, that's a valid question. Women must consider their own safety in a way that men don't, or in a different way to men. And at the same time, the space where women are most at risk is inside their own homes, for the most part, when we pull back and look at the experience of women all over the world. And I always got the sense when I gave this as an answer, you know, that actually the idea that women are that the threat to women lies somewhere else, lies outside of the home, lies in spaces like war zones, that the threat comes from foreign men, if you like, or strangers, is actually a mistruth. And I started to wonder about this idea, particularly in relation to journalism, which is so male dominated, and also, you know, filled with misogyny as an industry. And I wondered if this idea that it's not safe for women out there was actually one of the ideas that was being used to keep women out of journalism, out of jobs that have traditionally been inhabited by men. That, you know, if women stay home, it's safer for them.
In the sight of danger, definitely, yeah, as well, in that, you know, in that idea.
Yeah, and so I just had a really uneasy feeling about that. And that's why I decided to write into, you know, my experiences of violence inside the home, as well as witnessing violence in places that were at war. And this may sound like quite a grand statement, but when we think about what war is, two armies, two sometimes informal armies, sitting along a front line, killing each other or trying to kill each other en masse in spaces that have been declared war zones. I wonder also if there is a war against women. I mean, the sheer number of women who are killed and injured and abused by men inside homes worldwide every year is, you know, the figures are staggering, but yet we don't talk about this as being a war because it's so visible.
But yeah, I suppose it's so, you know, well put, that notion that war is always someplace else, whereas, you know, in what is coded as peacetime, or where there is not a literal war, as you said, you know, a war against women, which I think your work actually really excellently shines a light on, actually, because it seems such a deliberate pairing, and I suppose in some way, you know, relationships between men and women can at best be ambivalent, and, you know, can have a deep sense of animosity, and particularly culturally, and I always find it so interesting, you know, reading the collection, you know, alongside this story of war, there is this other story of, as you say, a different kind of war, one that exists almost everywhere, but between men and women. Is that something you felt, is that something, I suppose, that you deliberately paired thematically with the other work, or is it just something that, as you say, you know, in the environment that you're in the industry that you're in, and also, you know, I suppose just being a woman in the world, it's something that's inevitably going to, you know, come up in the work, especially when, I suppose, you know, typically we conceptualize, you know, men as soldiers, whereas women, and it's definitely something that comes up in the book as well, the role of women in war as the mourner, of the, you know, the man and the soldier, whereas the, you know, the man is constructed as the one who goes and does the fighting, if that makes sense.
In all of recorded history, more than 98% of combatants have been men. So war is constructed in this way to separate genders. I believe war may not be possible if men and women are not separated in that way. It's actually very, very difficult to get human beings to kill each other. We don't want to. One has to do a lot of work, a lot of warmongering, in order to convince human beings to kill each other en masse. I feel that I don't really have much choice over what I write about. I only began writing poems 6 years ago, and
that's so impressive. You only began, 6 years ago in the collection. I mean, it's such a brilliant collection.
Thank you. So yeah, I feel like these are my stories. They're the ones I have. They're the ones I lived, and so they're the ones I write. I'm not sure how much control I have over that. This is my life. These are my experiences.
No, totally. I wondered if we might be able to hear some more poems from the collection, if that's okay.
Of course. Welcome to Donetsk. You teach me this wartime trick, to look for living pot plants in the windows on Kievska Avenue. Most are crisp and brown, but one green geranium and a succulent spider plant offer proof of life for the person who waters them. Whole apartment blocks are abandoned, collapsed telephone lines, blown up branches litter the road. No voices, no tinkering metalwork in the distance, no buses, no playing children. Leaves rustle white noise. You say it's like Sunday every day. Stray dogs and swallows and the soft thud of shelling. So this is actually a reporting technique when we're moving through neighborhoods that have been very heavily damaged. Now in Ukraine also, we've been working together since the Russian invasion last year. And so in order to assess how many people remain in a destroyed neighborhood, one can look up at the windows and see which ones have living pot plants in them. This poem is the first poem in the section Stories No One Wants to Hear. And it's in 3 parts. And I should say, part of this poem is imagined. And although the poem is still true to my imagination and to the real experiences that spark that imagination. Part 1. Alcoholics don't dream is not a metaphor. I invite Dad to dinner. Since he's dead, he can show up anytime. He arrives at 36 when he became my father, and the age I was when he died. I play the Dad's Dead mixtape my brother made for our drive to his funeral. We sing Cat Stevens' Where Do the Children Play, and smoke roll-ups out the back door. 2. What's for dinner? A childhood game for when he fed me from empty end-of-week cupboards before the trip to town and gyro. What do you want? Dad replies. Fresh pineapples, whole coconuts, a bushel of yellow dates. I play along. Tinned peaches, meringues nests, toasted tea cakes and penny sweets. Tonight, my kitchen shelves are crammed. I lay the table and we slap a camembert onto the French stick, spoon ripe avocados, pluck sun-dried tomatoes from the fatty brine, lick orange oil from our fingers and thumbs. No one drinks, no hands tremor. 3. In a corner of the field where I grew up, blackberry briars built a wall of thorns around Dad's grave. Lilac wrapped limbs around the caravan door, moss crept over piles of empty wine bottles. Using Dad's old tools, my brother and I dug his grave after watching a YouTube video on how to dig a grave. We pitched spade through root, clumps of clay. My palms bled the deeper we got, the harder to stay in the hole. One swinging pickaxe, the other a shovel, back to back until we hit the water table.
Thank you. I suppose that's the perfect segue into kind of the way in which the collection develops. I find it interesting that you've mentioned and you've said before that typically war is conceptualized, or war poetry is conceptualized as made on the front line, and usually by soldiers, and definitely about other soldiers. But the thing that I was, that really came to mind when I was reading the book, the structuring of it seems to be in some way alluding to the geographies and kind of spatial dynamics of war, not only in the fact of the way that you've described your role on the ground as a photojournalist and kind of what that entails, boundaries, where you can go, where you can't go, but also the sense of that, from our experience as a reader, the collection opens in Ukraine, a contemporary event, where the speaker is a witness or even a bystander to violence, but then, from that trauma or from that event, the family or the home space really is back in time. The speaker's own experience is where, is really the site where violence has been learned and perpetuated. And there's that, as you've read from there, stories no one wants to hear. That section I find incredibly interesting as a turn in the collection. There's the line in it, Anastasia, some people only understand one language. And as you said, there is a real sense of the violence the speaker witnesses or is exposed to, but then later, to some extent, the violence that they perpetuate. But the one thing I was interested within that is that similarly, I suppose, in your work as a photojournalist, and the material that you're responding to in those poems, in the first kind of half of the book, this section you're still kind of drawing on archival experience, or testimony, because there are some kind of court documents that you draw on from your own family history. I just wanted to ask you, what that was like, and was it kind of is that part of your process, do you think, in accessing the personal experience in a similar way to how you respond to it when you're on the ground as a photojournalist and you have the image, or you're making the image, that when you are looking back at kind of personal experience and your own family history, that those documents were important for you to unlock something? Or is it a similar kind of aspect of proof or evidence, really, that you can get to something through the objective court documents, or the things that you use in those other poems?
Well, even when I write about or report on my own life, I use research as a tool. Obviously, dead dad didn't come to dinner because he's dead, but my brother did make a Dad's Dead mixtape for our drive to his funeral, and we did dig his grave ourselves, and my dad did play that game of pretending we had delicious fresh food when we had almost none. So facts become important, but when just that word in itself seems so useless, doesn't it, or so insignificant. My feeling is that the more difficult, the more terrible, the more violent and disturbing the nature of the thing that I'm writing about, the more brevity and sparse language is required of my writing in any case. So, you know, like, this is a common experience for people who've, you know, suffered from abuse, physical violence inside the home, is, you know, I wasn't really sure what had happened and what hadn't and how bad it was. And so I know that, you know, my commitment to understanding and documenting and highlighting violence in any form as a professional journalist comes in some way from my experience of violence inside the home. And in order to deal with that, I simply took a transcript from a court document that details a first-person account by my mother of my father's violence. And I thought, that'll do it. Maybe that's all I need to tell that story. Does that make sense?
Totally. And actually, you know, as you say, throughout the collection, the worse it is, or the, you know, the upsurge in violence, it seems the words get fewer, or the, you know, there is definitely, it seems to be another choice, artistic or political again, that even though of course you're dealing in poetry and, you know, metaphor and simile, there is a skepticism or a restraint in the poems, even when, you know, when it's you know, material about personal experience, which, you know, we could see as a kind of response from trauma, as you say, you know, you kind of gaslight yourself. Was it really that bad? But then equally in the poems that deal within conflict and in the war zone, there is also, it does seem to be a choice about tone in there, both, you know, with trauma, as you've said, but a choice not to stray too far into the realms of fantastic or kind of sublime language, which I suppose, as you said earlier, was that in part, you know, your reading of the, you know, the First World War poets, about that danger you mentioned earlier of kind of glorifying the very thing that they're kind of meant to be protesting or skeptical of.
Yeah.
Would you say that's a kind of a fair point?
Yeah, and I've really noticed it in the last year. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I've only been working in Ukraine, photographing and also writing a lot, and, you know, setting aside half of the time that I'm reporting poems, not just photography. And I definitely found that in the first weeks and months of the Russian invasion, I had so few words to describe what was happening. And I think that was, you know, an effect of being surrounded by so many traumatized people, and also, you know, experiencing some trauma myself, as having, even though I'm not Ukrainian, being in that space was very frightening, very traumatic, and above anything, just very, very sad. And so I noticed that my poems got shorter and I used less words because, well, when it comes to violence inflicted on this scale against a whole country, language as well as photography does become inadequate. And so maybe it's a nod to that as well, the inadequacy of language to describe that pain.
And I suppose its limits as well, which is something that, you know, towards after the section that you've just, you know, read from, it seems to me that the last two poems that you end on, Spring 1941 and 2011 in the collection, what I find very interesting, you know, we've gone from the earlier poems in the collection, which are kind of, you know, on the ground dispatches as they've been described, to how that possible trauma maybe sends the speaker back to mind their own personal experiences, their family histories, their, witnessing of violence in the home. But then what I find very interesting in the last two poems in the collection, it seems to be a nod to the intergenerational, well, I suppose both intergenerational trauma, but the kind of the continuity of war, and it's kind of the accrued effects of its memory. You have the figure of the family member, Alfie, in one of your poems, and in those two poems you kind of frame it in a very interesting way, a kind of about the legacy of war. I wondered if you could maybe speak about those two poems and maybe read one of them as we think about that kind of part of the collection.
Yeah, I guess it goes back to this idea that war is something that happens somewhere else to other people. And in my family, it's only been one generation since our family was torn apart by war. My dad was born here in Hackney, and my grandmother worked in a bomb factory, and during air raids would take him down to the tube stations where she nursed him when he was a small baby. And I think this idea that war is something that happens to other people in other places is very, very dangerous and very, very naive. I walk my dog every morning at the cemetery, a decommissioned cemetery across the road, and there's all these tiny little gravestones where children who were killed in bombing raids here in Hackney are buried. It's not so long ago. So I'm thinking about intergenerational trauma, but I'm also thinking specifically about the war stories that we inherit. My grandmother would never speak about the war. It was one of her rules. We don't talk about the war. That in itself is a war story, and it's also something that I've been thinking a lot about in Ukraine now, when I'm being constantly asked as a journalist, when do you think the war will end? And I am certain that for people affected by war, it never ends. They carry that with them. They carry that war inside them until they die. I think that's true. I think it's true, or I'm thinking about it being true right now. So in 2011, I was in Libya photographing the Arab Spring. And this is the last poem in the book. And yeah, it's a prose poem called Spring 2011. I spent my first night in Libya in Tobruk at the Al Masira Hotel, newly built and almost deserted because of the war. Food shortages had closed the kitchen, biscuits and orange squash for dinner. The next day, I drove west to Benghazi and to the shifting front line in the desert along the Via Balbia highway. This patch of coastal road had been fought over in 1941, the year Alfie died. Died as Allied forces tried to halt the Nazi advance from Tripoli. The road was again of strategic importance as Gaddafi's army moved eastwards, making contact with the rebels. That morning, I had found Alfie's grave in the Commonwealth War Cemetery, an imperial landscaped garden with immaculately kept rows of headstones. Plot number 8E6. He is buried in bare, dry earth close to the perimeter wall, beside agricultural fields and grazing camels. Small and delicate flowers grow as weeds, yellow and purple on his grave. I picked a bunch and left them there. I also pressed some in my notebook and posted them to Nan in a plastic 35mm film canister.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. It's so, yeah, I think that's such a powerful note to end on. And I just want to say thank you for speaking to us today. It has been really wonderful to hear both about the collection and your own work. And I would just like to say to anyone listening, as a reminder, that One Language is published by Smith Doorstep. And I believe, Anastasia, as well, you also have an exhibition of your photographies on at the Imperial War Museum. Is that right at the moment?
Yep, it's a Ukraine photographs from the front line is at the Imperial War Museum in London until the 8th of May.
Fantastic.
And thank you so much for having me, Oakley. It's really been a pleasure to talk with you, and also yeah, and just talking helps me figure out what it is I think and feel about things, because I'm not always sure, and those thoughts and feelings change as well. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity.
Not at all. Thank you so much.